Go. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last series and lecture in this great series that Dennis has put together with the Climate Center. And we wanted to welcome Jessica Thorn. She's a new postdoc working with me in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. Jessica is sort of a global scholar. She was born in Namibia and did her undergraduate work at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Then she did her master's degree, which was focused on climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction in Kenya. And then she did her PhD at University of Oxford. And so that's what she's going to be speaking with us about today. And she's a very engaged scholar, kind of our new model of maybe how we do research these days. Just one example, she's been a member and worked with the Young Scholars for Humanitarian Aid Program with the UN. So we're really excited to have her here at CSU working with our Mountain Sentinels group, and she'll be talking about her dissertation work at Oxford.
Thanks very much, Julia, and thank you, Dennis, and the organizers for inviting me to present today. The aim is essentially just to give you an overview of some of the work I've been involved in the last few years, and hopefully open doors for potential collaboration. So my title is a systems approach for understanding ecosystems, functional traits and well-being, and this is contextualized in the context of the Terai plains of Nepal and northern Ghana. Okay, sorry.
Just right here.
By way of introduction,
that should work now.
Smallholders, I apologize for the gap at the top. Smallholders play a prevailing role in conditions across the globe. Sorry, I've got a bit of a problem here. Jonathan? I'm not seeing my slides.
Can you see them now?
No, I can't. So they comprise 1.3 billion people across the globe, which is a significant amount. They cultivate between 0.5 hectare to 2 hectares on average, depending on the source. They're not purely subsistence, so they often engage in cash cropping. And just a paper came out 2 days ago talking about how they provide much of the food in urban areas in developing countries, particularly 80% in sub-Saharan Africa. So they play an important role in terms of maintaining ecosystem functioning. These pictures show, the previous pictures show a configured landscape of crops where you have multiple layers of crops as well as trees adjacent to naturally intact urban areas. Yes, thank you. They also drive change, it's okay. They also drive change through how they decide to manage the communities of plants on their farms, and that influences genetic makeup, the rate of species turnover. This is particularly important, as we all very well know. There's few places across the world which are under formalized protection, and this concurrently we have a growing intensification of agriculture, concurrently with income growth as people's consumption patterns change, where there's increased competition with arable land and urbanization, and we have predicted increases in population as well as food security needs. Their livelihoods are under direct threat of climate change, as we all know. So this is because they depend on rain-fed irrigation. They frequently contend with risks such as floods and droughts. They tend to live in marginal areas such as on slopes or boundaries of industrial land. And their traditional coping mechanisms are undermined because of the rate of change. And they also lack they have limited risk mitigation tools. For example, cash reserves, access to long-term credit, reliable weather forecasts with a few weather stations in remote areas, robust storage infrastructure, as well as developed insurance markets, although there are new innovations in microfinancing schemes in Senegal and Tanzania. And these people are moving to urban areas, We see a growth of informal settlements, and there's a new set of risks that people are facing as they try and engage in new livelihoods to send back remittances to families to cope with a new variety of risks. The UNHCR estimates since in the last 8 years, 22.5 million people have been displaced to such disasters, and many of these are smallholder farmers. So not only is this an issue of conservation, food security, and livelihoods, it's also an issue of moral concern. And Sovacool describes this using an example where if we think about the number of emissions per capita in rich countries, it's much higher than those in least developed countries where many smallholders are living. And concurrently, we also see up to 300-fold increase in health risks that may be attributed to climate. But the news is not all bad. We have the emergence, which I am a product of this education of the second green revolution, of re-innovation and reinvigoration in agroecological practices. And there's also this idea of climate smart agriculture, which is a concept developed by the FAO. And this is the definition of sustainably and equitably increasing production, farm income, food security, development, adaptation, while reducing greenhouse gas emission. It's a concept, it's an idea, it's a goal, it's not necessarily a practical output. And there are many initiatives, both globally and reports which are being represented by authors in this department that raise these issues. TEEB is now commissioning a new report, and even Syngenta has a project associated with this. This year, 37 LDCs received funds from the Green Climate Fund. We have national policies being developed, and the Sustainable Development Goals also promote these issues. Finally, before I talk about the gaps that we need to address, there's also an emergence of new kind of tools to address how to measure ecosystem services to assess sustainability at the landscape level. However, we lack a coherent evidence synthesis of what the effectiveness of all of potential climate smart or conservation land management practices are. A few frameworks talk about how to assess ecosystem services at the landscape level within agricultural smallholder landscapes. And perhaps most pertinently in the regions which I'm working, we still have a limited understanding of how communities maintain and benefit from ecosystem services, how provision might differ over climatic conditions, and how this contributes to overall socio-ecological adaptive capacity. And therefore, in this discussion, I'd like to present some questions which I've been thinking about. Firstly, engaging in a review of what what evidence there is of the effectiveness of these management approaches. What is one approach to quantify services concurrently with well-being in these landscapes, and then apply these to two contexts in Nepal and in Ghana. In Nepal, looking at unmanaged plant material around farms, and in Ghana, looking at pest and disease regulation. And then finally, talking a bit about my experience of engaging stakeholders in participatory modeling processes. So when you're trying to deal with such a complex, wicked approach, as many people who in this department advocate, I'm trying to work with science which is responsive to local needs, working reflexively through an iterative approach, closely with people who on the land in the co-production of knowledge. And secondly, viewing biodiversity, ecosystem services, and social processes as an interconnected whole rather than independent operating areas of analysis. And this draws from the idea of systems thinking, which basically just says that we need to make explicit the boundaries of our analysis because our disciplines, our sectors, our geographic scales of analysis determine how we understand a system. So the first main area I'm going to discuss is the review. A systematic map is a precursor to a review, which is basically just assessing what evidence is out there. This was conducted for C4 and is one of the first systematic maps in environmental evidence. And what it involved was engaging stakeholders in South Africa and Oxford, developing a protocol of the search criteria. And how we defined conservation land management was multifunctional agriculture, sustainable intensification, and conservation agriculture. I'm sure there's many definitions that could be used. And we decided to work in 76 countries, and that was based on the criteria of 3 databases on income, nutrition, as well as prioritized areas of ecosystem service provision. I know this is very small, but all I want to show with this is that we screened 21,000 articles in 5 bibliographic databases, looking also at key journal articles and grey literature. And after screening a title, abstract, and full text, we came to 746 articles. The database was developed, and what we established was information about crop types, with the irrigation methods, what type of services were measured, what management practices were being assessed, and also how these were being measured, and broad outcomes in terms of yield and ecosystem service provision. Unsurprisingly, we've seen an exponential increase in publications since the first paper in the review was from 1984, but particularly since 2000, we've seen a massive growth in publications. I know this is also very small, but the second thing I'd like to show is just these are the 19 practices that were broadly categorized. And most studies have been looking at organic fertilizer, tillage, and agroforestry, while fewer have looked at cover cropping and fire management. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether you think this is representative. Key services were supporting services and regulating services, particularly carbon sequestration, which might be due to interest in mitigation, and nutrient cycling because of the association with the clear association with soil productivity, soil regulation. And perhaps it's because many of these are more simple to measure or use techniques commonly applied in agronomy and provide direct goods for consumption. This looks at the distribution of studies, and a key point I just want to show is that in Central and North Africa, there seems to be a dearth of studies. There's many more studies in Asia, in China and India, as well as in Brazil and in Mexico. We also see that many more studies are at the plot scale rather than at the landscape scale, and this might affect the description of services that operate at the scale, like hydrological services. We see a greater number of studies in the short term, 1 to 4 years, which I'm sure is also not surprising, and fewer at over 20-year cycles. We also see that there's fewer bundles. 1 or 2 services are typically measured. And of course, these are very complex systems. So that could be attributed to that. Most studies are on research stations rather than smallholder farming systems. And very broadly, when looking at the broad outcomes, which requires further information about the effect size and particular research questions, which I'm happy to discuss afterwards, the 57% showed that these approaches broadly improve yield and ecosystem service provision. So the results are described in an online interactive map, which is freely available at this link. And you're able to look at, for example, if you're interested where studies have been conducted in agroforestry, which is showing here, you can link to the article if it's, for example, open access. So the main message is that this provides justification for working in the context in which, in rural landscapes, and also it provides a database, an online interactive map, which can inform future research. So having an understanding of this of the literature out there, I then try to think about, so what approach could I employ at the field or landscape level to measure ecosystem services in combination with well-being. And I know there are many approaches out there. This is just one, but we describe this as the rapid ecosystem service assessment technique. And what we did was review and gathered a comprehensive set of methods, and then tested this in diverse climatic, cultural, and geographic conditions, particularly Nepal and Ghana. You're all very familiar with the categories of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. These are the ones that were included. And although there have been subsequent refinements, this was employed because it's the first large-scale ecosystem assessment, and its categories are widely recognized. So this just describes that there was a suite of 7 ecosystem service measures based on 46 indicators. This allows for measuring benefits and trade-offs. And then you are able, this just describes, for example, if you're in a plot, you can measure pollination services by looking at vegetation rates. You can conduct sweep netting and pitfall trapping to look at ground dwelling and flying arthropods. You can look at, use bait laminar sticks to measure nutrient cycling, and look at what issues of water regulation and supply. And then concurrently, we developed a self-assessed composite index for well-being. And of course, it only captures it according to the view of the farmer, and it's captured at one point in time, and a much broader understanding of the system and engagement with stakeholders needs to really capture the nature. But it is useful perhaps in terms of being able to quantifiably link processes and well-being, services and well-being. And this was some of the criteria that we decided to use to select these measurements. The key ones I want to highlight is that this is just a picture of a little field kit you can carry around with you. And of course, there are trade-offs of working in a lab. You can get much more robust information. But if it's more designed for application in context where this does not exist. So that's a bit about how to measure the services and well-being, but the approach I've taken to look at, empirically look at climate change impacts now rather than using scenarios is to use space for time substitution. And this is a widely recognized method in ecology where you use to infer past or future trajectories based on spatial differences. So this image, the diagram shows, for example, if I have a site here in the year, and I'm interested about what will happen in the year 2030, I can go to another site that currently displays those conditions and use space as a proxy for time. And of course, climate is not the only variable that might influence change. So you also need to think about other aspects like soil, about proximity to water courses, about access to infrastructure or towns. And if you have the right data, you can generate outputs in ArcGIS, and the red represents a 5% dissimilarity Euclidean distance, where you can see Laura, which was the name of the village, which was the reference site. According to the A1B scenarios of the fourth assessment of the IPCC, this is what the current conditions are showing might occur in the future in Laura. There are strengths and limitations. There's many limitations to this approach. Most importantly, we don't know how systems might change, how human behavior might change, what people might be cropping in the future. And there's also many processes which we just don't understand in our modeling, but it does offer one way of empirically measuring potential changes in climate. And this is an example of an output. So for example, this is information of basic material of a good life, comparing regions I measured in Ghana and in Nepal, displaying current and future conditions. And this is water regulation and supply, which might include turbidity, E. coli, nitrates. And you might be able to start to ask questions like, does sanitation, is there any relationship with the quality of water, or is there any relationship between the livestock stocking rate or E. coli levels in water bodies? So this might offer a transferable tool to measure ecosystem services and well-being, to inform management at the landscape scale, and allow for cross-site and regional comparisons. So I'm going to look at two cases. The first is in Nepal. One might think of what happened there last year when you think of Nepal, or one might think of the beautiful mountains of Everest. The region I was working in was very different. It's between 150 to 500 meters above sea level, so in the plains. The reason why I worked there was because most of the population depends on subsistence agriculture, and there's a trend of respective drying, and this is what also correlates, is associated in the projections. So the gradient was from wetter to drier, from east to west, as the monsoon moves through the Bay of Bengal. And concurrently, there's also other rapid changes occurring with deforestation, political transition with the new constitution, and over-extraction of groundwater resources. So farmers are, just to provide context, people are seeing changes occurring in these places. For example, they associate environmental change with resulting in increased humidity, which affects potato production. Higher temperature and fewer rainy days means there might be crop losses in maize and rice. Flooding can result in siltation of land, and it also results in more diverted rivers or more intense structural requirements of irrigation facilities. So I measured across four climatic zones what was the plant species composition in and around farms, and also spoke to farmers about their uses, asking them to free list vernacular names rather than using predefined categories, and also talk about source and administration and work with focus groups, and finally categorize this and deposit this in the National Herbarium. The first result I found was, indeed, these landscapes are repositories of biodiversity. There's a rich amount of specimens that were found, up to 27 per site, which are not cultivated. These are wild or indigenous varieties. That's why I say unmanaged plant material. And the kind of uses or ecosystem services that are provided are predominantly for medicinal use, for ritual use, and for food requirements. This image shows the type of landscapes we're working in, and it was taken in Sagrapur in the Dung Valley. It shows, for example, multi-story cropping. There's diverse crops being cultivated, like potato and turmeric, and tomato. You can see there's mulch, there's there's close proximity to naturally intact areas. And this is also a composite image around the homesteads. They also have a very rich ethno-medicinal knowledge. So, for example, for gastrointestinal illness or fever, there's many different uses of these plants. And this knowledge is passed through orally, and there is potential. People are saying that there's potentially a loss in this knowledge as people move towards service industry and are discouraged from agricultural livelihoods. Another key finding, which was quite interesting, was that there was statistically different knowledge bases across castes, which is there's broadly 36 castes in Nepal. The first statistically independent group was the Sannyasi, which have a long-standing tradition of Ayurvedic cultural practices. The Dura and Gurung have been working in the Terai for a long time and engaging in subsistence agriculture. The Taru, the Brahmin, and the Chetri, as you know, are the higher caste, traditionally have more higher land tenure, and higher levels of education. And the difference in the 4 sites in terms of, there was no difference in terms of abundance, or total or proportional, but there was a difference in taxonomic diversity. And we found this as there was a change in precipitation and an increase in 3 degrees Celsius temperature. And qualitative inferences suggest that there's also differences in where people are finding their products. For example, bamboo is cultivated along river systems, which are impacted by flooding, or jackfruit, which is a highly calorific product, is only found in warmer areas. So finally, before I move on to the next section, they maintain many plants because of the services they provide, and particularly in response to the kind of changes that they're seeing, they currently are employing practices such as cultivating crops to boost immunity, treat malaria, support alternative livelihoods, or provide multiple uses. They have a comprehensive understanding of the system in which they live, which allows them to secure basic necessities and conserve biodiversity. And this knowledge, belief, practice enhances overall their adaptive capacity. So in Ghana, I looked at insects because they are poikiloothermic, and that means they cannot internally regulate their temperature. And this can have major impacts on health and production and livelihoods. For example, through the loss of livestock if there's just increased vectors of disease. Effects can be direct or indirect through precipitation or temperature, and could also be through, for example, flowering of a crop. And in this context, I looked at functional diversity. And of course, there are many ways of defining it. But the definition I used was looking at feeding guilds, 10 exclusive feeding guilds, which is a common approach used in animals. And ranking was at a general scale. That included, for example, detritivores, phytophags, omnivore scavengers. And this work was conducted with the Natural History Museum. The benefit of this approach is it's an approach to prioritizing conservation efforts, because you can look at how greater stability might be gained if there's a replacement of species with similar traits. So again, in Ghana, one might think of Khartoum National Park, the rich forests of West Africa, or one might think of the beautiful fisheries of the Gold Coast. But in the area I was working in was the north of the country, which is upper west and upper east Ghana. And here I just looked at 2 climatic zones. The region, again, represents 83% of the population is subsistence producers. And similar trends are being observed. Sedentarization of the Fulani herders, land division with population growth, and irrigation is a major concern. I estimated, well, my calculations showed that there was 3.7 hours a day is the average amount of time that people use to irrigate their crops in the dry season. And at the top, you can see the gradient as per the IPCC projections was from wetter to drier in the east. Farmers are observing late erratic and more intense rainfall. They typically see that there are shorter rainy periods, and this might affect the harvest of sorghum and millet. Their traditional weather markers are more unreliable, like changes in direction of wind, or the presence and absence of birds. And they're also seeing heavy rainfall with strong wind, promoting different types of pest infestations. And this image is just showing some women walking from the border of Burkina Faso into Ghana, crossing over illegally into a national park in order to extract fuel wood to sell. So it's a very, actually it's quite a dire situation at some points. Of course, there's many wonderful adaptive capacity is being promoted by necessity, but it is severely affecting livelihoods. And all I'd like to show in this graph, which represents a 20-year trend of temperature and rainfall, is that the main periods of food scarcity is before harvest, before the beginning of the rainy season and before harvesting, which they describe as the lean period. So in order to capture pest and disease regulation and the potential impacts of climate change, I used pitfall trapping and sweep netting, as well as measuring biophysical variables. I interviewed farmers about incidence rates and their perception, or their land management practices, verified with focus group and semi-structured interviews, and then again sorted this to ordinal and morpho-species level, and deposited this in the Natural History Museum in Oxford. Similar to what was found in Nepal, I would advocate that these landscapes are, again, repositories of biodiversity. There were 9,000 individuals captured, and most of which were, well, 30% of which were ants, many were hemiptera, bugs, and flies. And we found that there are more vegetation-dwelling and flying arthropods compared to ground-dwelling arthropods. And this just shows that we adequately sampled the region. No differences in abiotic variables of soil and water regulation were found. And so this is useful in suggesting that the farms share the same soil and water conditions regardless of temperature and precipitation regimes. When looking at taxonomic diversity and abundance, biomass and functional diversity, the only significant difference was in terms of functional diversity. In hotter, drier climates, we found in particular that there were more granivores. So the benefits of this is that they disperse and store seeds, but the limitation, well, the potential problems for production is that they feed on seeds and they can leave the crops damaged. We also found a greater abundance of long-tongue pollinators, and they are more efficient than short-tongue pollinators in the way that they deposit the pollen on the stigmas. We found a greater proportion of hemiptera, many of which are known as leaf hoppers, which is this insect, and this can cause economic losses and crop losses. And we also found a low proportion of hemiptera, and given the fact that we found that long-tongue pollinators were in higher proportion, we assume that this is short-tongue pollinators, such as Apis mellifera, which are bees. Differences found in land management was that there's larger areas cultivated in the hotter, drier conditions, that there are fewer insect pollinating crops, particularly, for example, pumpkin, and that irrigation is more mechanized. So people are not necessarily using handheld buckets, but they're using motor pumps. And of course, these questions, there are many confounding variables, such as the prioritization of budgets in the national allowing for access to development. But it might infer some potential changes. And then finally, when talking to farmers about their perception of incidence and severity, the only difference that was found was for a particular pest, and that was the same as which was found in the sample of counted samples, which was Hemoptera, which is a leaf hopper. And interestingly, which might be obvious to some researchers, but still needs to be stated, they do have a strong understanding of the compositional and functional role of these insects. They could identify the 8 major genera of pests using vernacular names. They talk about the impact of the insect life stage on production. They understand the role of crop maturity and variation in seasons on pest incidence, and their role in decomposition, pollination, and predation. given these changes and that they are observing, the key points that came out of the stakeholder engagement are, in order to promote resilience, the current practices that they're employing are trying to engage in pluralistic forms of extension, given budget deficits. So, for example, using approaches of e-extension, which Evoca, a research program, is currently looking at in the region. Using looking at training of trainers, or engaging the private sector in commercial outgrow schemes. Biological control methods using neem and striger, as well as livestock urine, are some practices employed. They use push-pull cropping and intercropping to control pests. Information is trying to be disseminated to be more specific in the application according to season and crop type. And there are still many pesticides which are illegally banned in the US, for example, Lambda, which causes blindness, that are being used in this region. So those farmers are trying to increase awareness of the impact and washing vegetables, for example, when buying crops from the market. The key take-home message in the second empirical study is that increased granivores and decreases in long-tongue pollinators could ultimately lead to seed storage, cause crop damage, but also cause crop damage and losses with detrimental impacts on pollination. We see that there is a value in working in these small landscapes, particularly because there are few collected samples in these regions, and they need to be archived for future conservation. Finally, I'd like to just talk a bit about something that many people in this department are engaged in, which is working with decision makers in participatory modeling processes. And prior to coming to CSU, I've worked at regional, national, in 4 major processes. And I'd like to just talk about one at the local level. So the approach we took in engaging with these decision makers is to first ask people how they understand the system, and what are the different components. And different methods of doing this could be using exercises like, what is important to you? What are your challenges and responses? What are your assets, your capabilities? And then what are the actors and how are they engaging with each other? And then the second process is to talk about the relationships and feedbacks between the components. And then that can be conducted using cognitive mapping or rich picture construction, which there's an image here of that, which is basically just using non-verbal means of describing various components of a system across geographic levels. Then envisioning alternative plausible futures. So this can be through farmer exchanges, scenarios, or talking about visions and aspirations. And this is a collage that was built with farmers in Nepal that were not literate, just talking about what they'd like to see in the future. Then using backcasting approaches or other approaches to explore alternatives to reach that future. And that can also involve not looking at the desirable future, but potential trade-offs, and also looking at hard adaptation pathways, which might be involving infrastructure development, and also soft adaptations, so like skills. Ideally, if you've got grounded data, you can then fit the models, calibrate the models, co-design a pilot to implement potential envisioned futures, and then monitor the impact and refine the approach. So in 2012, 4 years ago, I worked over 4 months working on something called Farms of the Future, which was a project conducted for CCAF's Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security of the CGIAR. And we took farmers from a community called Beora in Rupandehi district in Nepal. And we went to 3 plausible future villages in Dang and Chitwan. And first we had a community diagnostic workshop. We then thought about we did the backcasting exercise on the envisioned future. Then the farmers went on these 3 exchanges to plausible, diverse scenarios, given the uncertainty we have in our projections. Came back to the village, revised their backcasted plan, decided on an approach they'd like to employ given what they think about the future and how they'd like to get there. And then they piloted a program with seed funding, which was provided. And after deciding between livestock revolving funds or a communal irrigation pump, they developed a cooperative for vegetable farming. So these are very complicated systems we're working with. And this is just, we know that, yeah. So if you just zoom into one section of a model of the kind of variables that have been collected, this is a cognitive map, which was developed based on my data from Northern Ghana. And I just zoomed into one aspect of soil regulation and supply. This, of course, is not comprehensive, but the idea is, for example, this is the soil regulation and supply, and you have various chemical processes. You have aspects around management, like intercropping. You've got considerations of physical soil, like soil texture, and then you can also think about the land management history and ownership. I'm not a soil scientist, but I think that this is just trying to display how farmers understand the interconnections between these different aspects of the system. And then you can, once developing this cognitive model, you can try and populate it. I know you can't see what this is showing, but the green represents aspects of well-being, blue represents aspects of ecosystem service provision, and independent variables is in red, like land management practices. And just by way of example, I highlight 3 interesting findings. For example, assets and infrastructure seems to show a strong correlation with physical health, which might be the amount of times people have been measured in terms of the amount of times people have been to hospital, had certain diseases in the last 6 months. And assets might be shelter or access to sanitation, or yeah. And then we have, for example, a negative relationship between yield and livestock counts and soil regulation and supply. And then you might also see a strong relationship between social stability and physical health. So part of that involved, for example, amount of alcoholism or migration, and physical and how this impacts physical health. So the take-home message of this is that this approach might be beneficial for stakeholders. Besides trying to understand a system and co-producing knowledge, it helps people to be sensitized about their assumptions of the future. It facilitates capacity for governance and implementation. People might build new collaborative networks through these processes, raise their community profile, and promote organizational skills. And it also promotes experimentation in communities. So going back to the 5 questions that I presented at the beginning, I've tried to talk a bit about a review of the effectiveness of conservation land management, how to measure services at the landscape scale, apply this along climatic gradients in 2 regions, and then work with stakeholders in trying to construct understandings together of the system. And there's been many people that I've worked with, which I need to acknowledge. And I'm very excited to be in this department and learn from your work.
And that conceptual model that you showed about 4 things back, and you zeroed in on the soil processes. These are the traditional farmers, and they're talking to you about phosphorus, nitrogen, soil pH, and so forth. Is that correct?
I've measured those on their farms.
Oh,
So yeah, that's through direct measurements.
okay, so it's not something that they talk to you about.
But the other aspects within the model they have. So
Okay.
for example, their perception
I'm
of
just
the
trying to
quality.
tease out of that how much of it is information that the local people actually have and how much of it is ideas and data that you brought into the system. One more. Yeah, here we go.
So the white represents the information that I
Okay.
measured, the data I've collected. The gray represents information that was, well, this was information, for example, that farmers described.
Okay. But overall, it's more your conceptual model than it is the conceptual model of the local people.
Yes, it was through the whole model was not developed through one process. It was through a series of processes. So it's a composite model. And I'd also like to have, there is also potential secondary data that could be also incorporated. So like for the availability of fertilizer subsidies.
You described this process you had in Nepal, I think it was, that you envisioned like 3 alternative futures or something, and there was a kind of a participatory process, and then it was was the objective then to have the people, the communities that you worked with, were they then trying to work out strategies to achieve those desired alternative scenarios? Could you elaborate a little bit more on what all was involved? Or I didn't it was like the backcasting,
Sure.
I don't know, there was a lot of stuff there.
Sorry.
I don't quite get it, but yeah, I'm just sort of stuck.
There were 3 alternative scenarios, and some of the scenarios were that there there was an increase in precipitation and a decrease in precipitation in one of the scenarios, and this was just based on outputs of downscale GCMs, and then going to ground truth in these communities. But within the communities, what I think was most interesting for the farmers was just to look at the practices that are being employed in those places. So for example, where in Beora, which was the village that the farmers came from, they don't cultivate peppermint, they don't cultivate garlic. There's new ways of cultivating sunflower or different methods of cropping potatoes, and all those, and greater community organization. So those were kind of so-called adaptation strategies that they saw that they could engage in order to.
So they came up with if this scenario comes true, here's our plan for dealing with that kind of.
Yes, yeah. So they developed a plan given their current knowledge before they went on the exchanges. And then they went on these exchanges, and then they revised whether they think that this is what they'd like to achieve for community development, because we tried not to frame it within the context of climate change only, because it's a systems problem. And they were deciding amongst livestock revolving funds, communal irrigation facilities, because they were all individualized, or cooperative. And it was the main point was to develop something that they could generate more income in the future and be independent. I mean, it was quite an interesting process in terms of the seed funding and the implementation afterwards, because that's not typically the research objective. And my perspective is that really gave a lot of valuable insights when we went back and monitored the impact, whether it was long-term change or it only lasted for a year or two.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question there. So when you're working with these different groups, I'm assuming there's probably short-term and longer-term planning, and I'm curious how interested they are in dealing with short-term changes that are going on versus the longer-term changes that may occur. What is your experience?
The planning horizon, I guess, is typically no longer than 15 years. I don't know if people have a different opinion to that. But I think it's more about necessity, I guess. I think the lifestyle of these particular farmers we're talking about is very, they think on very seasonal time spans, given the need to respond to changes very quickly. And most of them are purely subsistence or semi-subsistence farmers. So this is why the year 2030 was selected, because they could still think about 15 years time. But I think this is, in terms of their understanding of the long-term sustainability, for example, soil functioning and changes in biodiversity, there's a longer kind of thought process going on. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does. I mean, it sounds like they're probably thinking more about the short term, next decade maybe. But if, you know, some of these scenarios, you go out further than that and they become more and more extreme. And I don't know if there's anything one could do now to address that, or if it's just too soon to address it. I'm just curious how these, local people are thinking, how they think about that, or if they're thinking about it. And it sounds like they're more thinking about the near term, which makes sense. I don't disagree with it.
They are undergoing very rapid change in terms of development, and since I've worked there, even there's been a 25% increase in concrete housing in the area, and many people are going to the Gulf to work. So the livelihoods are changing, and with that, I think practices are perhaps that's a good thing, that there's longer term thinking being incorporated into planning.
It's encouraging to hear farmers understand the ecosystem services like pollination and decomposition. The question I have is, do they also understand the following steps, the interconnectedness, or just the first step, like what decomposition also brings next about new soil nutrition value, stuff like that. So, and next to that would be, do they take any actions to promote or advance some of these processes?
I think the processes that the interconnection, I think that's a really interesting question. Perhaps just off the cuff of my head, maybe like pollination, I think is very difficult. Like the underlying supporting services are quite difficult to understand the relationship between and to try and promote practices. I don't think, for example, I ask questions about what are the pollinating pests and most pollinating insects, and most of them didn't know. But I do think, like provisioning goods and services, there is more clear management directed towards that. But how do you engage people to try and understand their perception of the relationship between these processes?
Oh no, I was just trying to learn from you.
Okay.
I was just surprised that you think they understand. I think the obvious ones. I come from Africa as well. My worry was to understand the connection between the different processes. That's why I did a lot of soil degradation. So when you came and said, well, farmers understand the ecosystem services of the environment, I was encouraged. But how much do they know the whole complete process? And because if they know, they would go and actively, support and advance those, services.
A more fundamental question, maybe, in these landscapes, the way that we're delineating these services might not be relevant to their social worlds. we work on a very quantitative basis. And there's a much more inherent understanding comes from their traditions and their culture and their identity, which allows people to really feel the interconnectedness between these systems. And you experience this when you're living in their contexts. And I think that's a real challenge in trying to describe it in the way that we are talking about these processes.
Great, thank you, Jessica.
I have another question.
Yes.
So I'm not, maybe I don't really understand your diagram model. Is it a quantitative model in some way? You get predictions out of it, you show
This, I think that we had major complications.
As soon as you left, it started behaving badly.
Yes.
Oh, what happened? And if you can't,
She couldn't get to her notes. None of this was,
Oh.
it was,
I mean,
this
it's something
was, and I didn't know how to get it to
Well,
do what it needed to do, so.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay. Okay. Where the hell is all of this?
They don't